Good afternoon. Hello. I can tell you're all very pro-social because we're having such good conversations. So you're in the right place. Today we're hearing from Dr. Kory Floyd about the importance of being pro-social. As a friendly reminder, I'm the director of the Francis McClelland Institute, and our goal is to be a premier research institute, and we are carrying forward the legacy of Francis McClelland, who was a business leader and a philanthropist, and who truly understood what it means to be resilient as an individual and as part of a larger family network. She was always an advocate for research that helps to improve the lives of children, youth, and families. We're also here because of the generous support of Pamela Turbeville, who has supported this speaker series on family and consumer sciences. Pamela is a University of Arizona alumni, and she was a recipient of the CALS Alumni Association Award in 2000. And today we have Dr. Kory Floyd, who walked all the way over from the communication building to be with us today. And thank you to Dr. Melissa Curran for this recommendation to bring Kory over here. Yes, we're all very excited. People in the building all day have been telling me they're looking forward to it. So Dr. Floyd is a professor of communication at the University of Arizona. He received his PhD here at U of A. He's a native of Seattle. He completed his undergraduate degree at Western Washington University and his master's at University of Washington. He teaches courses on health communication, emotional communication, close relationships, communication theory, and quantitative research methods. He is a prolific writer with 13 books and over 100 scientific papers and book chapters. His work is primarily in areas of affection, emotion, family communication, nonverbal behavior, and health. His work has been recognized with awards by the National Communication Association and the International Association for Relationships Research. His most recent book is entitled The Loneliness Cure. It examines the issues of affection deprivation and identifies strategies for increasing affection and intimacy in close relationships. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Floyd.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Sure.
So I imagine that from time to time we all have one of those days. And I want to start off by telling you about one that happened to me in the not too distant past. It happened to be the first day of the new summer school session. And I was racing to get to school that day to teach my first semester course. But it happened that on that particular morning there were not one but two accidents on the 9-mile stretch between my house and my office. So by the time I got to campus, I was already running late, and you know how you are when you're running late, kind of flustered and trying to catch up. And I'm sitting in my office preparing for my class when I get a call from my doctor, and it's not good news. So now I'm not only late and flustered, but I'm sitting in my office stewing about this news and what it's going to mean for me, and I'm going online to search for medical information, which is not necessarily a good thing to do. And so I'm feeling very, very overwhelmed when a knock comes at my door. And I open the door, and it's a student who says, I just wondered if we were going to have class today. I said, well, it's the first day of class. You know, of course we're going to have class today. He says, I'm only asking because we've been sitting down there for 20 minutes waiting for you. So I grab my books and I grab my water bottle and I rush down to my classroom. I rush in, I put down my books, I put down my water bottle, I spill my water bottle all over my books, and now I'm trying to get the screen down so that I can do my presentation. And so I'm trying to talk to them, you know, welcome to class, and clean up the water, and I'm standing on a chair, literally yanking at the cord to get the screen to come down, when one of the students in the front row says, you know that's electric, right? And so then I pretended that I knew that. And so then I walked over and flipped a switch and then turned out all the lights in the room. So this has all happened within the first, not the best first impression, right? The first 3 minutes of class. And so by the time I got back to my office, after that disastrous first showing of class, I was really feeling low. And I happened to spot one of my colleagues in the hallway, and she did one of these with me. She did like this look up and down. And then she says, "Do you need a hug?" And I said, "I can't even tell you how much." And so she gave me a hug there in the hallway outside my office. And that hug did not do anything to change what had gone wrong in my day, which had been many things up to that point. But it changed everything about the way that I felt. So suddenly all of those things, being late to work and the bad news from the doctor and the horrible first impression of my class, they were still with me, but none of them really seemed quite as overwhelming all of a sudden. And I could tell that I was relaxing, I was calming down, my heart wasn't beating quite as fast as it was a minute ago. And that's a pretty profound effect for such a small behavior. I mean, it couldn't have been a second, maybe two, that we stood there and hugged, but it changed everything about the way that I felt and the way that I was managing the stress that had visited me that day. And that's a moment among many, maybe you've had a similar experience when you've been really stressed out, that I think about a lot in my research when I realize that there's a very strong connection between what happens to us in terms of our social behavior and the way that we think about, and more importantly, the way that we feel about the experiences that we encounter in our lives, in the grander scheme and also in the day-to-day level. And that tie between our social behavior and the way that our bodies experience the world is a theme that we're going to visit a little bit today in my talk. What I'd like to do with our time together is frame this discussion in the context of pro-social communication. And that hug that I got from my colleague would certainly qualify as an example of that. So I want to start a little bit broadly, and then I'm actually going to narrow our discussion a bit from there to talking about the communication of affection in particular as one example of pro-social communication, and the example that I have spent 20-some years now studying and reading about and thinking about and living with, trying to understand why it is that such a small, seemingly insignificant behavior can have such a big effect. And I'll conclude with, I think, some at least qualified claims that can come out of this research program. I would like to start with the observation as we think about pro-social communication that we as human beings are profoundly social beings, right? Easily the most social of all the social primates. And when you think about many of our cousins in the animal kingdom, there are those species that have evolved such that once they are weaned from their mothers, they really spend the rest of their lives in relative isolation, in relative solitude. They may come together when they need to mate or to defend territory, but other than that, they're kind of out there on their own, right? And we are in sharp contrast to that as a human species, easily a very social species, but that doesn't mean that we're always pro-social, right? How many of you grew up with a brother or sister? So you understand the concept, I imagine, of being in a relationship in which you can both love the person and hate them at the same time, right? And that's kind of profound when you think about it. There aren't that many relationships, social relationships in our lives, where we can feel quite so positive and so negative to such intensity simultaneously. I love you, but right now I kind of can't stand you. And we can hold those conflicting emotions in only a very narrow slice of our relational experience. But that would be an example of a relationship that's always social, it's just not always pro-social. So what do we mean when we use that term? Well, I try to think about things in terms of communication, that's my background, and the way that we not only feel social experiences, but the way that we express them, the way that we present them in our relational lives. And when we think about something as being pro-social, I think about it as the kind of expression or behavior that will contribute to positive relationship development and maintenance. And that includes a number of different things. Affection, certainly, and I won't talk about that now because we'll talk about that in some detail coming up. But it also includes things like compassion, which is our experience of seeing pain or suffering in someone else and being motivated to do something to help alleviate that. It includes altruism, the idea that we would give of ourselves without any expectation of return. When I send money to a flood victim in some country that I can't even find on a map, is that altruistic because I don't get anything back from it? Well, possibly. It would certainly fit into that category. And trust, of course, our ability to trust other people, to trust what they say, that they're going to do what we expect them to do. All of these things are part and parcel of our ability to be pro-social as part of the human species. And of course, none of that negates the fact that we are also very antisocial, right? We can visit pretty big atrocities on each other. And it sort of underscores the fact that we're a complex species in that way. That we can be profoundly pro-social and profoundly antisocial, sometimes at the same time, sometimes in the same breath, right? We're quirky that way. I spend my days thinking about affection, though, and affectionate communication. And to understand that, I think it's important to distinguish between those two terms, because we often use them interchangeably, but they're not quite exactly the same thing. When I think about affection specifically, I'm really thinking about an emotional experience, something that happens internally, a feeling of love or fondness or desire to be around somebody, to be with somebody. And I contrast that in my work with affectionate communication, which are the behaviors through which that kind of feeling gets manifested or gets expressed. I say here in parentheses, although it's not a parenthetical point, it's an interesting one, accurately or inaccurately, the behaviors through which affection is conveyed. And here's what I mean by that. As humans, we have the ability with many of our emotional experiences to separate the internal affective experience from the outward expression. So to put this in the context of affection, we certainly have the ability to feel affection for somebody that we choose not to communicate. And we often make that decision, say, early in the trajectory of a new relationship, where maybe we haven't said that to each other yet. Maybe I'm not sure how the other person feels, so I have feelings of affection, but I may choose not to express them just yet. The flip side of that coin, though, for us as humans, is that we also have the ability to express emotions that we aren't actually feeling. And anyone who's been around children is familiar with their trick, which is to come up and say to their mom or dad, I love you. And mom looks down and says, what do you want? Right? Moms can see through this. Kids don't know that yet, but they learn that they have the ability to express that regardless of what their underlying affective experience is. They have learned, and we know, that it's possible to use affectionate communication strategically. My purpose in communicating this to you is not because it's coming from a place of actual affection, but because there's something I want, and I can use an expression of love to get it. Years ago, when I started thinking about this idea, I thought, I wonder how common this is, that people might do that. So I picked everybody's favorite group to study, college kids. And I did a survey of, there was a little more than 1,000 students at universities and colleges around the country. And I simply asked them, have you ever expressed affection to somebody when you weren't really feeling it, but you had some other motive in mind? Now, what percentage of college kids do you suppose said yes to that question? Yes, I've done that. 50? 100 cynics. It was almost 90%. It was 88%. And of that 88%, almost 2/3 had said that they had done that at least once within the previous 2 weeks. So this was not an uncommon thing to do. Now, the good news is that when I asked them, so what actually was your purpose? What was your motive in communicating expression? Not all of the motives were self-serving, purely self-serving. Many of them were, in fact, quite alter-centric. So I told the person I loved them because I felt like that's something that they needed to hear in that moment. Or I expressed that affection because it seemed like we were kind of headed toward a fight, and I wanted to, derail that. There were, of course, those students who said, well, I really just wanted to sleep with the person, or I wanted to borrow money, or I needed some favor, some very self-serving motives. But the good news is that those were actually in the minority. That most people who had said that they had expressed affection in a non-accurate or non-genuine way did so for reasons that weren't at least entirely antisocial. But it does seem to be a more common phenomenon than even I would have predicted. And so that's an important point to keep in mind. Now, when we think about the behaviors that we use to express affection, accurately or inaccurately, we can certainly divide them into verbal and nonverbal statements. And at first glance, those categories would seem both mutually exclusive and exhaustive. At first glance, they are. So verbal statements would be anything that we say or write, or these days tweet or text, anything that we put into language. And sort of by definition, nonverbal would be everything else. But as we started to catalog and do some descriptive qualitative work to try to figure out what were the modes of expression that people used to convey affection, it became clear to us that there was a further division between behaviors that were nonverbal but very overt, hugging someone, holding their hand, kissing them, and behaviors that really seem to be more in the line of I show them that I love them by the things that I do for them, the ways that I support them, the favors I do, acknowledging dates that are important to them, offering to help when they need it. Those are more socially supportive behaviors, some of them verbal, some of them nonverbal. But they really seem to us, at least, to be qualitatively different than these very direct gestures that we use. And so early on, we made the decision, my colleagues and I, to divide it this way. And actually what we have found often with many populations is that of all of these forms of affection, this is the one that's not only the most common in their relationships, but it's also the one that's most valued. We often hear the sentiment that, well, anybody can say they love you. I look for people who show me that they love me. And more interestingly, on that point, we often find that this is the most common mode of affection expression in relationships between men, where more overt forms of affection may not be particularly welcome. They might be a little uncomfortable. I can talk to brothers or I can talk to male friends and say, how do you guys know how you feel about each other? Well, he always has my back. Or he always pitches in to help when I need him. That's how I know. It's not because we hug. It's not because we share Hallmark cards, right? And to them, that's very valuable. That would be a kind of behavior that's really easy to dismiss and say, well, that's not real affection. That's not genuine. That doesn't really have any value. But in many relationships, it is the most valuable. So I'm glad that we had that epiphany early on and thought to include that in the way that we measure this behavior. Now, one of the things that struck me about this behavior early on is that it is not without risk, right? Sometimes when we express affection verbally or non-verbally to somebody, we sort of put ourselves out there, not always clear what the reaction is going to be. I had this epiphany many, many years before I became a social scientist. Actually, when I was growing up, I came from a very, very affectionate family. Yeah, we were all over each other growing up. And so I sort of went into the world thinking that, well, if that was true for me, then, it's true for everybody. Everybody loves affection. Everybody's cool with it. And so I was that huggy kid, in high school. And quite quickly discovered that, not everybody is down with that. There were those people who, if I would hug them, they would hug me back. And there were those people who, if I would hug them, they would tell me to go stand over there. And that was perplexing to me. I thought, who would not want affection? My God, it's the best thing in the world. But it got me thinking. Clearly there are people in certain situations who don't. So it got me thinking later on about, are there risks associated with being affectionate? Yeah, of course there are. One of the most obvious ones is the risk of non-reciprocity. Have you ever said, I love you to somebody and their reaction to you was, thanks? Awkward, right? Affection, like a lot of emotional expressions, is a highly reciprocal behavior. There's a very strong expectation of reciprocity for a behavior like this. So when you don't get that reciprocation despite that expectation, it's super awkward. And that's a huge risk. What if I say it and they don't say it back to me? And so we think about those things, especially again in the early stages of a relationship, in the early part of a developmental trajectory where maybe we haven't had that kind of exchange and I don't know how the other person is going to respond. There's certainly also a risk of misinterpretation. What do you mean you love me? What are you saying here? Do you love me as a friend? Is this romantic? Do you love me as like you want to go have sex? You know, what exactly are you trying to convey here? And of course, that risk can manifest itself in all sorts of misinterpretations. The expression might be intended as romantic, for instance, but interpreted as platonic or vice versa. It certainly, as we know, could be interpreted as a manipulation attempt even. So there's that risk as well. There's a risk of social or cultural censure surrounding the fact that among all of its other characteristics, affection is a very rule-governed behavior. So we have rules about how to express it. We have rules about where and when it's appropriate to express. So behaviors that would be considered okay at a party, maybe not so appropriate at church, right? We think about those things within our own culture. And then, of course, there's lots of variance when you go from culture to culture, not just in the ways that affection is communicated, but also in the rules that surround its expression. So if I'm unfamiliar with those, or if I'm sort of putting myself out there to take a risk, there's also the risk that I'm going to receive some pushback, basically, because of that. And then one is particularly interesting is just the risk of disease transmission. You know, affection is a very intimate kind of behavior often. And so when people are in close proximity, when they're, like we used to say in high school, swapping spit, there's a risk that, that we're sharing germs, and that if I am harboring an illness, I'm going to pass that along to you. And we all sort of understand that intuitively. When we have the flu, we don't go around kissing and smooching, but it is something that poses an extra risk, particularly for communicable diseases that are aggressive or that are particularly problematic. Some research has actually found that people intentionally curtail their own affectionate behavior out of misunderstandings of diseases that they themselves harbor. So they misunderstand the possibility that they could communicate that disease to somebody else through something like hugging or kissing, and so they don't do that, even though that's not the case. So these are all risks, and I think that, given all of those, it behooves us to ask the question, why be affectionate in the first place? If it is such a risky activity, what's the benefit? So let me transition into that, because that question, what's the benefit, has sort of consumed my research agenda for at least the last dozen years, if not more so. And I'm going to answer that question in this way, which may seem a bit bold, but I'm going to make the claim that the reason that we are affectionate, despite all of its risk, is that is a fundamental human need for us. Let's unpack that statement a little bit, because I don't use the term need loosely here. We have a lot of things that we like, a lot of things that we want as human beings, but there's a very small number of things that we actually need, right? We need to sleep. We need to eat food. We need to drink water or vodka. We need to breathe air. There are certain, and a very small number, of things that we could really classify as a fundamental human need, without which we do not survive or thrive as human beings. And so it's a bit of a bold claim to put something like affection on that list. But I make that claim anyway for a variety of reasons, really. But among them, the observation that as highly social beings, we have what social psychologists refer to as a need to belong, right? Not a desire to belong, not a preference to belong, a need, such that when we don't meet that need, when we experience ostracism, or when we experience loneliness, or when we are disconnected from the people in our lives, there is a number of mental and physical health detriments that quickly follow from that. It's the reason why the worst punishment you get in prison is solitary confinement, right? The worst thing I'm going to do if you've been super, super bad is lock you in a room away from everybody else. Now, I will say that there are times in my life when solitary confinement doesn't sound half bad. Like, a couple weeks away from my students, my colleagues, like, sign me up. There are those moments when I think that. But you probably know as well as I do the research on solitary confinement, which shows that a person's mental wellness and state begins to deteriorate, not after a matter of weeks or days, but after a matter of hours. Not just without the contact, but also without the possibility of contact. And that's really the difference between solitude and solitary confinement. I can choose solitude, but that means I can change that decision, right? I think to make the argument for affection as a fundamental human need even more concrete, we can think about the fact that from infancy on, we have certain needs that are absolutely relevant to our survival. And before I get to affection, let's think about what those are. So once again, unlike many of our cousins in the animal kingdom, we are not born into a state of self-sufficiency. Maybe that's an understatement, right? So many other species, of course, within hours, within days, within weeks of their birth, they are walking about, they are learning to hunt or forage, they're able to meet their own needs. They are what we would call self-sufficient. And as human beings, of course, we don't measure the path to self-sufficiency in hours or in days or in weeks. We measure it in decades, right? Due to what I call the advanced state of dependency into which we are born. We are virtually helpless to meet our own survival needs, not just as newborns, but well into our first several years of life. And so until that time, our very survival depends upon someone else's ability and willingness to meet all of our fundamental needs, right? Shelter, food, clothing, medical care, absolutely everything that we need to survive. And so you kind of have to think exactly what would motivate us to do that. Because that's not a drop in the bucket that a new baby needs. You know as well as anybody the statistics on the cost of raising a child. The government puts them out every year, and it's, like $250,000 somewhere around there. And that doesn't even include, U of A tuition. That's just through age 18 and just covering a child's basic needs times however many children you choose to have. And, that's a lot of dough you're forking over. And so I have to ask, why would a rational person choose to invest that kind of, and that's just money, right? All of the other resources that go into raising a child, time, energy, attention, the opportunity cost, everything that requires, why would we choose to do that, and willingly so? And of course the answer is that we love that child. Of course I'm going to do that. I love that child. That's kind of the key in my mind, that it's going to take an equally powerful motivator to get us not just to do it, but to do it willingly, to make that substantial an investment in someone else's well-being, and then to do that over and over again. We're not even talking about grandkids yet at this point. So what's that motivator? Well, a very large part of it for us as human beings is love. Why do I do it? Because I love them. And love makes me think that I could not possibly do otherwise. Of course I'm going to invest. Of course I'm going to lay down my life for that child. And so when you think about it in those terms, it doesn't seem quite as inconsequential, this idea of the need for love, the need for affection. I would go so far as to say that an infant who can't get someone to love it is an infant who is not likely to survive infancy, right? Because that's the motivator, or at least a big one, for everything else that infant is going to require. And certainly that need for affection doesn't go away after we emerge from infancy, right? It morphs itself a little bit, but that need to belong is still with us into adolescence, into adulthood, into old age. We never really lose that. And that's not to say that all of us need the same level of affection or attachment to other people any more than we all need the same amount of sleep, or the same amount of food, or the same amount of vodka, right? But nobody needs zero. Well, maybe vodka, but when it comes to our fundamental human needs, nobody needs none. And I would make the same claim as it comes to affection. When we lack a sufficient amount of affection in our lives, that's a state that some researchers have called skin hunger. It's highly detrimental to us. You know, that might seem like a situation like loneliness, where if you haven't experienced it yourself, it's really easy to write it off as kind of a first world problem. Like, it's not really consequential, it doesn't really matter. It matters enormously to the people who are experiencing it. It's highly detrimental in terms of their mental and physical health. And so these kinds of observations in my line of work have caused me to think about, if affection is such a fundamental need in our experience as humans, if the lack of affection is so detrimental as we know it to be, then what's the mechanism really driving the benefit that affection and affectionate behavior offers us? What was it, for instance, that allowed that hug from my colleague in the hallway to totally turn around the trajectory of my day and the way that I felt? And I realized that what happened in that moment, what happens in many small moments in our lives, is that somebody hugging us or holding our hand or just smiling at us when we're having a tough time does a lot to reduce our stress. It does a lot to reduce the stress load that we are all walking around with in those states. And so I thought, well, maybe that's part of the answer, that affection can be beneficial to give and receive, partly because it helps our bodies modulate the stress response, the way that we react to stress, and counteract some of its negative effects. And so if that's the case, you know, how does that happen? What's transpiring in the body that produces those sensations? And is it possible that getting more affection in our lives can actually be good for us? You know, that seems like a really simplistic question, and it comes from a very simplistic observation that affection feels good to us. And it doesn't just feel good psychologically. It doesn't just feel good emotionally. It feels good physically, right? When you hold somebody's hand, or when you kiss them, or when they put their arm around you. There are physical sensations that go along with that, which means that something is transpiring internally, and gets me to think then, could affection be good for us in the same way that sleeping when we're really, really fatigued is good for us, or eating when we're really, really hungry is good for us? I want to talk to you in sort of general terms about some of the findings that have come out of 12 to 15 years of research studying that question. So I'm not going to get very much into the weeds into any of these studies, but focus more on the findings and more on a bit about what I think they mean. And I want to start with the question of how affection and affection exchange is related to our mental wellness. And these are results from a number of different studies looking at a number of different markers of mental health. These are primarily correlational results. Some of them experimental, but primarily correlational. And so we'll just talk about them at that level here, but you can see the direction of associations in the parentheses behind the markers. So happiness, of course, tends to be associated with how much affection I have in my life. And when I use that term, how much affection I have, let me talk for a minute about measurement, because that's important here too. Unless you are manipulating affection behavior, which we often do, there really is hardly a better or more valid way to measure it than by self-report. You know, self-report gets maligned a lot, and often for good reason. But when it comes to a behavior like sharing affection, number one, that's often a very private behavior. So it's not the kind of behavior that we can generally gauge just through social observation. And it also can be a relatively infrequent behavior in some relationships. So in my mind, as a social scientist, those factors are powerful motivators to take a self-report measurement strategy. Because if I want to know what's happening in people's private lives, and especially how they perceive it, that's been our approach, at least. And we've really taken two different strategies within that to understand and index affectionate behavior. One is to measure behaviors within a specific relationship. And that gets back to that tripartite model: verbal, nonverbal, socially supportive. Our measure follows that model, where within your marriage or within your relationship with your mother or your relationship with your friend, what is the frequency of these behaviors as ways to express affection? The other option, the other strategy we've used, and we've used this one actually more out of the two, has been to measure affection almost like a trait. Recognizing that some people are just more affectionate human beings than others. If we rate ourselves on a continuum, you know, I'd be way down at that end, super huggy, super affectionate. You know, some people would be way at the other end. Most of us would be in the middle. But irrespective of individual relationships, we have a trait level, I think, of just how comfortable we are with that behavior, how much that's a part of the way that we interact with others. And so these findings really emerge from that measurement strategy. So when I talk about having more affection in our lives, what I mean is a higher trait level of giving and receiving affection irrespective of the specific relationship. And so when you have a higher trait level, you tend to be happier, you tend to be less lonely, more socially engaged. You report less chronic stress. And you're probably familiar with the stress buffering idea that comes out of behavioral medicine, that things like social support, and I've extended that to include this, things that sort of feed our need for pro-social interaction tend to protect us from stressful situations. So that's not a surprising finding there. I don't know if you know what alexithymia is. Is that a term that's familiar to some of you? It's not a mental health issue per se, but more of a personality trait that indexes a person's general inability to interpret emotional expression, or to even interpret their own emotional experiences, or to put them into words. So these would be people who would have a tough time reading the emotion on your face, or putting into words the emotion that they are feeling. It's not quite as severe as something like autism, but certainly in many ways along that same pathway. So alexithymia tends to be negatively related with affection, as does depression, as does the probability of actually having been diagnosed with a treatable mood disorder or a treatable anxiety disorder. Now, as correlational findings, of course, these may have some causal merit to them. They may stem from a common cause. In most cases, we don't know, because that's not really where I've spent my attention and my energy as a researcher. I've been much more interested in how affection sort of lives within the body. And again, back to that moment of when I get a hug and I feel better physically, what's transpiring in the body to produce that? This has really driven a lot of my research agenda in the last several years. And so some of the findings to emerge from that include that compared to less affectionate people, so again, thinking about affection as a trait, highly affectionate people, number one, react with less arousal to a stressful event. So that's the stress buffering hypothesis in play. The idea is that affection, social support, that sort of cadre of pro-social experiences, we kind of carry around with us as a type of bubble or shield, so that when we encounter stressful events, we react to them, but we don't overreact. And you probably know with stress that there's kind of a Goldilocks zone when it comes to a stress response. You don't want it to be too small, and you certainly don't want it to be too large. You want it to be in that zone, in that middle, where it's actually going to be beneficial and not paralyzing to you. So people with a lot of affection in their lives, they will react to stressful events, but they're less likely to overreact. And when they encounter those stressful events, as naturally you might expect, they recover more quickly from them. Some of the work that has shown that has been of the variety in which we will actually induce acute stress in people, and then give them a variety of tasks to complete after they've reached their stress peak. And no matter what we compare it to, being involved in expressing affection to somebody that they care about accelerates their stress recovery faster than anything else that we would give them as a comparison or a control. Interestingly enough, just feeling the affection doesn't do that. So there's something about putting that affectionate feeling into words or gestures, usually words when we do this kind of study. There's something about expressing it that is where that recovery benefit resides. It's not just in the emotion itself. A number of findings have shown that almost without exception, people have better immune function if they have a higher trait level of affection. I say almost without exception because there have been a few. Most recently, we found that people who are highly affectionate have a higher level of circulating antibodies to Epstein-Barr virus, which might sound like a good thing, but it's actually a bad thing. You want fewer antibodies because more antibodies means that your immune system is not holding that virus in a latent state. Epstein-Barr virus, of course, is the virus that is responsible for mono, which of course we call the kissing disease, right? You see how this all comes full circle. You may not know that stress elevates your blood glucose level, but it does. And so for healthy non-diabetic adults, we see lower blood glucose levels in people with higher levels of affection. And then one study that I am going to talk to you about, I think it's on the next slide, is that people who have a higher level of trait affection have better rhythm over a 24-hour period in their stress hormone level, cortisol. So we call this the stress hormone. It's an adrenal hormone, and in the absence of acute stress, it follows a 24-hour pattern in which it peaks right when you wake up or within 30 minutes of awakening. That's when it's at its highest point, and it falls pretty sharply during the morning and the early afternoon, then kind of tapers off, and it reaches its lowest point around midnight, and then the cycle starts over again. And it turns out that the differentiation in that 24-hour period is associated with a healthy ability to react to stressors as you encounter them, part of what we call the HPA axis. So you want a lot of variation in that hormone level over a 24-hour period. When people have a dysregulated HPA axis, we tend to see almost a flat line in their levels throughout the day. This was one of the earliest studies that I did, and so it's fairly rudimentary in its method, but in this particular study, I had healthy adults take 4 saliva samples over the course of a normal day. So when they woke up in the morning, around noon, around 4 in the afternoon, and then before they went to bed at night. And I measured their trait levels of how much affection they typically express and how much they typically receive from others. And that particular measure divides those into 2 separate subscales. And the hypothesis here was that their level of trait affection expressed would be positively related to the amount of variance in their curve, in their cortisol rhythm over the course of the day. And you can see it was strongly related to that, even controlling for the effect of received affection. And that's an important point, because often when we think about the benefits of expressing affection, they can often be the benefits of receiving affection sort of masquerading, right? Because it is such a highly reciprocal behavior. So we wanted to tease it out a little bit. That's not a perfect way to do that, but it allowed us to tease that out a little. And I wanted to show you, just for illustration's sake, I graphed the cortisol rhythm of the most affectionate person in the study. This was the participant who scored the highest on a measure of trait affection, and this was that person's cortisol rhythm. This is a textbook cortisol rhythm. This is exactly what you hope yours looks like, because it's indicative of a healthy ability of your HPA axis to respond to stress. Now take a look at the cortisol rhythm of the least affectionate person in the same study. It's virtually a flat line. Now, you may notice that this person's average level is actually higher than the less affectionate person. That may seem counterintuitive, that, well, if cortisol is a stress hormone, you would expect this person's average level to be higher, but it's not about the average level. It's about the variance over the course of the day. Interestingly enough, the most affectionate person in this study happened to be male, and the least affectionate person happened to be female. Exactly the opposite of the central tendency that we find on that trait. But just for illustration, I wanted you to see what a stark difference there was, simply based on that measure of how affectionate they were as a trait. Let me tell you in detail about one other study. As we're starting to think about, well, where do the benefits of affection reside in the body? And one obvious option that has been sort of in our discourse for at least the last 8 to 10 years is oxytocin. Whereas we call cortisol the stress hormone, we often call oxytocin the love hormone or the cuddle hormone. And so I wondered, given that we know that affection has this kind of stress buffering effect, that when people have a lot of affection in their lives, or even when they share affection right before encountering a stressor, their reaction to that stressor is muted. It's buffered. They're protected a bit by the stressor. I wondered a few years ago whether oxytocin may be partially responsible for that effect. Because that's an effect that's well established in the literature, but the mechanisms behind it are not well established or not well understood. So in this particular study, there's a bit larger N, and I actually measured affection in a couple of ways here. I wanted to see how much affection people were sharing in their relationships in the several days prior to the study. So I had them keep a diary. Basically, it's the daily measure, but over a 7-day period. And then when they came into our lab, we did a standard laboratory stress induction, 45 to 50 minutes. I expected in response to the stress induction that their cortisol levels would rise, and they surely did. What I was interested, though, in this study is what was happening to their oxytocin levels in response to the stressor. And what happened is that both what I would call the state level affection, which would be that week of measurement before the session, and their trait measure, so how affectionate are you overall, positively predicted the oxytocin response. So if I was a highly affectionate person, in reaction to that laboratory stressor, the more affectionate I was, the more my oxytocin was elevated in response to the stressor. And that's a little counterintuitive too, right? We expect cortisol to be elevated in response to a stressful event. But my thought is that if I have a high amount of affection in my life, if I'm part of that group that would experience a stress buffering effect, I almost think about this as oxytocin kind of coming to my rescue, to counteract, to antagonize the effect of the cortisol on me. So whereas my non-affectionate counterpart in the study had a significant cortisol elevation, but a very tiny oxytocin elevation, they're having the stress, but they're not getting the buffering. They're not getting anything to counteract that. Whereas I have this high oxytocin elevation that's working to keep the effects of the cortisol in check. Now, that's my interpretation. I could be entirely wrong about that. But at least the effect was substantial enough for me to think oxytocin may play a role as a mechanism in that buffering effect. That will remain to be seen, but we have identified it as a possibility empirically so far. So with a few minutes I have left before we open it up to questions and discussion, I want to draw what I think are at least some qualified conclusions. In my mind, they're always qualified, right? They're always tentative, because the next study tomorrow could make me think quite differently about them, but I think that's good social science for all of us. But I would start just with the observation that affectionate communication is relatively ubiquitous as an experience of pro-social behavior for us as human beings. There certainly is cultural variation in the way that affection gets expressed, in the context and the rules for it, but not in whether we do it or not. The presence of affection is as close to a cultural constant among social behavior as I could think of. It's ubiquitous among us humans who have to serve a very powerful and very omnipresent need to belong. And among social behaviors, of course, this is one of the ways that we do that. We initiate relationships, we maintain relationships, partly through reinforcing our feelings of affection for that person. We know it's certainly associated with mental wellness. The causality of that is still unclear, but the associations are strong. There certainly is a basis for investigating the causal relationships. And with physical health, we have a lot more causal data to show that when we can actually intervene on affectionate behavior, we can actually produce outcomes that are health supportive. One of the most interesting studies I think I've ever done was a few years back when I wanted to see what would happen if I could just get married people to kiss more. So I rounded up a group of couples. They had to be either married or at least cohabitating. And in the experimental condition, that was the entire instruction. Over the next 5 weeks, I want you to kiss more than you do now. And that was back before we did data collection online, so I was having to email them, and I would get in touch with them over the course and say, are you guys kissing? Smooch, smooch. And I will say that I've never done a study in my career in which I've had so many people thank me at the end for letting them be in the study. Actually, it wasn't initially the participants, it was actually their partners. Thank you for getting my wife to kiss me more, was the general message. And she will volunteer for any future studies that you have. But we have found that if we can intervene to increase affectionate behavior, in that case it was a nonverbal behavior, but we've done this with writing too. We get people to write love letters to your family or to your romantic partner, people that you care about. They can have stress recovery and buffering benefits for folks. I think that for me, even as a social scientist, often some of the most interesting implications of these findings are at the policy level, where I think about what are now very pervasive policies in many spaces, whose purpose is to curtail this very kind of behavior. So in school environments or in workplaces, we have strong policies now. Don't touch, don't hug, don't be in proximity, no PDAs. Public displays of affection are a thing of the past now in schools and workplaces. And these policies, I will say, are well-intentioned. Right? We want to protect kids from sexual aggression. We want to protect workers from sexual harassment. I do have to wonder, though, given what we know about affection and social behavior in general, if we haven't maybe taken a baby with the bathwater approach here and gone a little bit too far in the service of trying to protect people, especially in the school environment, especially with children. Right? I mean, as well as I do, children need affection, and most of all, they need it when they're distressed. And I couldn't imagine being a school teacher in that kind of environment today and having to look at a distressed student who's crying and in need of comforting and be unable to, that would kill me to have to do that. When I was researching my book on loneliness, I was looking at these policies in some detail and came across a study that just kind of broke my heart and made me kind of question our collective sanity at the same time. About a middle school student in the Midwest, and he was expelled from his 7th grade middle school, not for getting into a fight, but for hugging the teacher who broke up the fight. And he was expelled from that. I have to wonder about our collective wisdom a little bit. Have we not sort of gone collectively insane when we think that that's a good idea, right? So I'm not going to fix that, obviously, but I think that if there's anything at a policy level that my research has to say, it is that we may be causing new problems in the service of preventing old ones here. We may end up being more harmful than we recognize when we are curtailing this kind of behavior 100% and kind of taking a no, do not touch approach across our social experience like that. Now, let me say that none of what I have said today, none of the talk about the benefits of affection, how it's good for us, how it feels good, none of that is a prescription for you to go out and start hugging people on the street, right? That is not the kind of behavior that will lower your cortisol or boost your immune system. That's the kind of behavior that will, get you incarcerated, where, ironically, you may end up experiencing more affection. The point I'm trying to make is that affection is one of those social behaviors that we reserve for the most special people in our lives, for our families, for our romantic partners, for our very close friends, for people that we care about. A lot of social behaviors will enact with virtually anybody in different contexts, but this is not one of those. Affection is special. And I think if there's sort of a take-home message from my research is that one of the reasons it's so special is that it feeds this very deep and abiding need that we have as human beings not to be alone. So with that, I will thank you. Yes.
So I thought your talk was great. For sure exceeded my expectations. Thank you.
Thanks.
So I have a lot of different questions. So I'll just give you some of them. So the first thing I was thinking is that there's this great book called Floyd, Love Too Much. Does anyone know it? I'm the only one who knows the books that I recommend. But it's a really interesting book. It's about this boy who has this condition, and I'm not going to remember that Williams disorder. And it's like the opposite of autism, where he literally, like the boy and then others like him, literally come up and hug everyone.
Okay.
So I thought your point about
Sure.
how affection and the context of affection and when it is important needs to have that context, because like the story is about him and his mom and how his mom is freaking out at every possible moment. So it's cute when you're a little kid, and then when you're a teenager,
Not so much, yeah.
So
yeah.
I thought that
Absolutely.
Okay, so that was more of a comment. The second one is that I was thinking, I'm guessing a lot of this is with heterosexual folks, right? So I was thinking, what about public displays of affection with folks who are non-heterosexual? Because often, from a minority stress perspective, for example, to be non-heterosexual and to display feelings is not, it might be dangerous.
It's riskier, yeah,
it might be
absolutely.
riskier,
For
right?
sure, for sure.
And I mean, maybe you qualify that by saying that this is done more privately, but I am thinking about how you see affection expressed publicly, and perhaps that would also be advantageous for heterosexual couples, which PDAs are allowable and acceptable, and
Right.
like, in fact, embrace, like think about like the kiss cam.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
But then if you are non-heterosexual, perhaps, like you said, it's more risky. So anyways, just thinking about that. And then the last one I was thinking about is, so say that you don't have a partner and or you're long distance and or your partner is out of town. What about your dog? Like, you hug your dog and then write love notes to your dog? I mean, would that have the same, yeah, would that have like the same positive effects, like physiologically and mentally? I mean that in all seriousness.
Maybe kissing your dog, not so much,
Okay.
but
Especially all those germs.
you know, I mean, you're probably familiar with research that shows that petting your dog and cuddling with your dog lowers your stress level and it lowers your cortisol and your blood pressure. It actually has the same benefits for the dog. So it lowers the dog's cortisol, it lowers the dog's blood pressure, just as if the dog were a human. And I don't take your point lightly because it's a common conundrum for people. You know, I may be in a relationship, but I never get to see the person. I never get to interact with them, or maybe I just don't have a relationship at all. And you know, one of the to not veer too far from the point, but this is an interesting story. When you write, I've never written a trade book before. The Loneliness Cure was my first foray into writing for a popular press. And one of the things that happens when you put your ideas out into the public discourse is that sometimes people will find you and reach out to you that you don't know, but they'll say, you know, I read your chapter on thus and such, or I just read your example on this or that, and boy, that really spoke to me, and it was, you know, dead on. And so in that vein, very often people will write me out of the blue and say, I'm just so lonely. I don't have anybody. One of the most recent, and it's actually turned out to be quite an interesting ongoing conversation, was a Catholic priest who reached out and said, you know, for obvious reasons, I don't have the normal outlets for giving and receiving affection, and I am so lonely. I am so affection deprived, and what do I do? And you know, and I don't have magic answers, and I'm not a clinician, so I can't sort of treat it that way. But certainly, one of the things I talk about in the book is the importance of being aware of all of the avenues and venues that you do have, even ones that don't seem obvious to you at the time. And you know, anybody who's been around dogs knows that, you know, they're kind of affection personified, and so there's great benefit in that. Absolutely, yeah, that's a really good observation. Yeah.
Thank you for an interesting talk.
Thank
I
you.
guess I had two questions that come about thinking about the mechanisms.
Yeah.
And I'll just ask both in whatever order. But one is you did touch on the actual expression somehow mattering.
Yeah.
And any further thoughts on what that's about at the mechanistic level? And then secondarily, pretty much for the trade kind of work, everything that we know is good about affection is bad about hostility. Do you think hostility and affection are like two ends of the same thing with the same kind of mechanisms? Or two different processes and different mechanistic things going on?
You're going to be dissatisfied with my answer to both of those questions because it's pure speculation at this point. To take the first one, we have discovered, or we have noticed that that effect, that the internal affective experience is important, but it's not sufficient to produce the stress recovery effect. So people who we ask to simply sit and think about a loved one and think about how much you care about them and why you love them so much, you know, trying to induce the affective experience, there's almost no advantage in terms of stress recovery, in terms of coming back to their homeostasis or baseline level, over people who do absolutely nothing but just sit quietly. It's about...
People are asked to just sit quietly, spontaneously think about loved others.
Well, they may. There's no reason to think that they would, at least not systematically, but we notice that it's an effective actually doing something with that, with those feelings. And so in later studies, we have contrasted the affection, the expression of affection with the expression of other kinds of thoughts or feelings. Because I thought, well, maybe it's just the fact that they're doing something instead of just sitting and thinking and feeling. And even that doesn't have the benefit. So it's the combination of feeling and expressing this pro-social and relationship-specific affect. And why is that the case? I haven't the foggiest idea. Yeah, it's been a very robust effect, but it would be pure speculation on my part as to what that would be, and I don't even know what I would speculate, quite honestly. As to hostility, I tend not to think about them as ends on the same continuum, and that goes back to my observation earlier that even within individual relationships, we can be openly hostile and still feel a great deal of love for the person. I think in those instances, the love tends to be long-term and the hostility tends to be short-term. So I love you, but I'm mad at you right now. And so to me, those are separate continua that we feel more or less intense experiences of. But again, that's speculation on my part. I don't have anything to back that up, other than I don't think that thinking of it as one continuum comports with this idea that we can feel those experiences simultaneously. Yeah. Other questions? Yes. I think it interferes with us being affectionate. It can, certainly. I mean, at a very local level, it can interfere with our ability to pay attention to the person who's sitting in front of us. On the flip side, I think it creates opportunities for sharing affection that we didn't have 20 years ago. My first teaching job when I graduated from the U here was in Ohio, and so for 2 years I was in a long-distance relationship with my spouse, and that was before Skype, and I don't think I even had a cell phone back then. So those were some big long-distance phone bills, like $300 to $400 a month back then. And I would have given anything for the technology that we have today as a venue for that. Technology is a really tricky thing because it's really easy to bash it and its effects on relationships. And some of that is warranted, but not all of it is. It's been a problem in relationships. It's created new problems that didn't exist 20 years ago, 10 years ago. But it's also been a real boon for our social experience. And so I think it has both kinds of effects, positive and negative. And some of the doctoral students from my department, some who are here, are studying that very question. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah.
I don't know the literature on this at all, but I was just kind of thinking about that people who are like affectionate, if it's activating some kind of dopaminergic reward system for them, so they're actively seeking. So especially if it's being reciprocated.
Yeah.
Is there any literature on like the dopaminergic system's involvement in like the reward of being affectionate?
There is, not from me.
Okay.
So that's a particular system that I have yet to look at.
Okay.
But there are some folks in anthropology in particular and some in behavioral medicine like health psychology that have looked at that very thing. And we only understand the very sort of tip of the iceberg of it right now. I think one of the most influential models of that comes from an anthropologist named Helen Fisher, who has divided the romantic relationship trajectory. You're nodding because you're...
her like big tech talk on like
right.
physiological effects of being in love.
So she's been very specific. One of the reasons I like the model so much is she's been very specific about which systems are implicated in which stage of development, right? And so I think she would probably put dopamine in the middle of the three stages, if I'm remembering correctly. So at the first stage is primarily driven by things like testosterone and estrogen. The middle stage primarily driven by dopamine and serotonin, and the long-term attachment stage by oxytocin and vasopressin in her model. Which doesn't mean that those don't overlap, and they're certainly not mutually exclusive. But she, more than anybody else, has illuminated that in a way that we just haven't understood it before. Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks. Anything else? Yes?
I'm wondering how the type of affectionate communication matters. I remember your story at the very beginning of the lecture, and at that your colleague provide really overt and
Mhm.
normal affectionate communication, I'm curious about if he or she provide another kind of covert or
Yeah,
some
yeah.
kind of communication, does that have the same effect? Or if what your colleague provides is not what you need at that time, does
Mhm.
that matter?
Yeah. Absolutely. No, all of those things are relevant. And I would go even one step further and say that what's also relevant is not just what the behavior is, and not just whether it meets my need, but also how do I interpret that behavior within the context of our relationship. So one of the things that you really can't account for when you're measuring affection systematically, which of course you have to do in social science, is forms of expression that are more idiomatic. So in some relationships, and maybe this is true for you too, I have a particular behavior that only the other person and I recognize as a form of affection. So we know it.
True.
What's that?
It's totally true.
Is it totally true? Yeah.
Totally 1,000,000% true. Yep.
So we get it, and when I share that behavior with that person, it has one effect, and if I share the exact same behavior with anybody else, it wouldn't have that effect at all. So all of those things are relevant, but more specifically to your point, one of the other effects that we have noticed, especially in the context of stress and stress recovery, is that forms of affection that are tactile, so that involve touch, are more powerful than forms of affection that do not, in terms of stress recovery. So if I can give you a hug, that will accelerate your stress recovery more powerfully than if I tell you that I love you, or if I wink at you, or if I do other types of tactile behavior, hand holding, kissing, anything that involves contact. That's kind of a special category when it comes to stress recovery, more so than any of the others. So I think all of those things are relevant. You're absolutely right. Yeah. Go ahead.
Especially in like workplace settings or professional setting. It's not your fault, I guess. Put out touch that's not wanted.
Yeah. Yeah.
Someone's like, oh, we need a hug and I'll touch you.
Right.
And you're like, no thanks.
It's very context specific. You know, you can probably all think of experiences when you've gotten a hug from somebody, and instead of making you feel calmer and less stressed, it creeps you out, right? And that gets back to the point I made at the close of my talk, which is that affection is a very special social behavior, not the kind of thing that we share with just anyone. And when you think about it from the perspective of risk, right? That's one of the biggest risks, is that I'm going to express it in a way that is not going to be welcomed by the person receiving it. And in those instances, it is not a boon to your health. It is not something that's going to buffer you from stress. It's going to have exactly the opposite effects. And it's interesting that you bring that up, because I would say that in this line of work, in doing this research for so long, the question that I get more than any other question from audiences, especially from public audiences, is how can I get my wife, father, kids, neighbor to be more affectionate with me? What can I do to get more affection in my marriage or more affection in my family? And one of the things that I say in response to that is that the thing to not do, what you can't do, is force it. So I often hear people say, tends to be women mostly, who will say to me, I've tried everything to get my husband to be more affectionate with me, to tell him he loves me, to kiss me, to hug me. I'm at a point now where I'm just going to put my foot down and demand it. Say, either you or I'm out of here. And I say, well, first of all, breathe. Second, I understand why, you might feel like you have tried everything. and there's no hope. But trust me when I say that is absolutely the worst thing you can do. If that's actually the outcome you want. Now, maybe she just wants an excuse to, leave him, and then maybe it'd be very effective for that. But you can't force it on people who aren't ready for it. And it speaks to your broader point that if I am not ready or receptive to experiencing affection from a particular person in the workplace, in public, wherever I might be, then I'm going to have a stress reaction to that. It's not going to decrease my stress, it's going to elevate it, right? And I said, that's exactly what you're going to do to this person who you're going to, demand be more affectionate with you. It's a tricky thing, and it requires a level of social intelligence. What I've often done is in meeting new people, or at the end of talking to somebody, I'll ask them, is it okay if I give you a hug? And not many of them have said no, but not zero of them. So then, okay, yeah, how about a nice handshake instead? And fine, because I don't want to, I don't want to cross that boundary with them. So thank you so much. This has been a real pleasure.